You are listening to the Hiking Radio Network, where we talk the walk with shows by hikers, about hikers, for everybody.
Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. Join Steve and his guests every week as he staggers from Georgia to Maine.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. You're listening to Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. And I'm your host, Steve Adams on Mighty Blue. You've found episode 362 of the podcast, and in pretty much all of my previous shows, I've tried to tell a story of the person who's appearing as a guest. Today we have a very singular character, so much so that I had a hard time working out the story we wanted to tell. Leah Harman, or Twig, is a kind of hiking dervish, having hiked so many trails that it's hard to keep up with her, really. And she hasn't been doing these long trails all her life. This wanderlust has been with her most of her life, yet it's only fairly recently that she's kind of devoted her life to backpacking. I found her fascinating, and I hope you will too. Also today, the very last member of our Mighty Blue class of 23. As you can tell, I've packed out the squad this year. We had so many unable to make it to the end last year that I wanted to make sure we followed enough this year. And this interview is with a lady I met at our Woods Hole weekend last October. Her name is Mary Marks, and as luck would have it, we hadn't been able to record since she joined the class of 2023. However, yesterday morning at 6:30 a.m, we spoke, and she was in a hostel in Franklin, North Carolina. So today, we're going to have an intro and a catch-up all in one. Mary will be on after Leah. Then Dr. Lynn's back, telling us about the horrors of ticks and, more pertinently, Lyme disease on the trail. While I remember, if you have any subject that you'd like Lynn to cover as we move through this series of some of the medical aspects of hiking, just email me at steve@hikingradionetwork.com and I'll make sure that Lynn gets it. We've already pre-recorded our next two subjects, which are blisters and wounds, so let me know if you have a subject to join that list. Then George Stefanos demonstrates, in the most wonderful way possible, the guilt-free eating that you can look forward to when you're hiking a long-distance trail. I was actually laughing at it as I was reading, and after a couple of takes, I left my laughter in. Happy days. So now let's hear from Leah Harman, or Twig. Our guest on today's show is Leah Harman, or Twig. Hey Leah, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're lucky we've caught you because you've been a busy woman the last couple of years. And one thing I want to ask you immediately, and I often forget to ask people this, is how did you earn your name? Or were you named by somebody else, or was it one of the trails that named you?
It was mostly a college nickname that kind of followed me. So I was gifted it by one of my best friends, and we were on a crew team together, and I just liked the name, and it's I guess it's connection to nature, and it's short and simple. So.
Yeah, short and simple. There's the best ones, aren't there? Yeah, there are some very complicated ones out there, so that's a pretty good one to have. And you're one of these people who are trying to be, and we've heard several guests recently, they're trying to be pretty much full-time on a trail somewhere. I know you're at home in Miami right now, but how did this desire to be out in nature start within you?
I would say it started very early in life. I just loved being outdoors. I grew up in Colorado, and I used to go riding horses with my mom and just always spending time outside. I hated to be inside. It was stuffy.
Is that still the same, by the way? Is that still the same?
I have to go outside at least once a day, right? Yeah.
Oh dear.
I need the fresh air and I need the sunlight. Yeah.
And I was looking through your website prior to having a conversation with you today, and I was struck not only by how many trail miles you've done, but how also relatively recently this all started for you in terms of getting out onto long trails. Why did it take you until you were, I think you were 38, before you went on your first through hike? Is that right? 38?
Yes, that's correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So what have you been doing then?
I would say that doing long trails is just a further extension of my somewhat nomadic lifestyle. starting with joining the Coast Guard when I was 18, so 20 years
Right.
prior to through hiking. I definitely had a wanderlust, and I wanted to get out there. I wanted to get away from my landlocked state and go sail on the oceans, and that turned into a career working on ships, research vessels. Have a background in marine biology. I just wanted to see the world, and I got to do a lot of that working on ships because I was in a different place every day, and I love that aspect of traveling. And that is what really appeals to me about through hiking, is basically waking up in a different place every morning and just getting to see the world pass by my eyes.
It's still a distinctly different thing, though, isn't it? You know, you're be on a ship all the time. When you did marine biology, were you doing research on certain things? What was the work you were doing?
I started out my early career, I was a fisheries observer. So I went up to Alaska, and I worked on fishing boats out of Alaska and also Hawaii. And I would just go out there and collect the data on the fish they were catching. And that was sponsored by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And I ended up working for NOAA as a ship officer later on and doing research for that organization. And then I got out of NOAA and still was working on ships. I worked for the University of Miami and was their small boat manager and helping facilitate the research that's being conducted here in Miami. So I've always had a ancillary or direct involvement in doing marine research.
But that certainly wasn't feeding your wanderlust, though, was it? I presume the fact you were not so much stuck in Miami, but doing things in Miami. I know you're outdoors, but you weren't actually doing this travel thing.
Right.
The transition from being on a boat to hiking, what were you, or in fact, what are you still looking from in a long hike? Is there something specific that you go out there for, or did you just like the whole idea of a through hike?
I would say I started backpacking actually in my early 20s. In conjunction with my career, I was also seeking the outdoors on land, and I would go hiking anywhere I would be in port. I've been hiking on all sorts of tropical islands. I actually had one of my first backpacking experiences on the big island of Hawaii. I hiked up to the top of the volcano, and that's Mauna Loa, and spent a couple nights up there. So I just loved being able to get to places that are hard to see unless you use your own 2 feet to get there. So I've always been backpacking ever since I was, even, just going for day hikes in Colorado when I was a little kid. And that progressed into carrying a pack.
Yeah, but what I meant by the question really was what do you get out of it? What are you actually looking for? Or do you go on a hike because you just enjoy the whole thing? Or is there something you think, I want to do that hike for this particular reason? I want to see this, I want to see that. Or is it just, let me just explore the world?
Yeah, I know a lot of people have very interesting backgrounds in what brought them out to the outdoors to hike. They're searching for something, searching for themselves. I really just like to walk. And I've heard that sentiment expressed by a few other people. I wasn't really so much searching for anything. I was just really enjoying traveling in a way that you see so much as you're walking. Time kind of goes by slowly, and you can, everywhere I've ever traveled, I just really enjoyed walking around and seeing my surroundings. So I think hiking and through hiking, it just was a natural progression, just getting to see as much of the world as I could on my own 2 feet.
Well, you've definitely been doing that. And we're going to talk about some of the trails you hiked in a minute. But let's talk about when we had a conversation the other day and I took some notes, you told me about one of your initial attempts to go backpacking. You told me it was a bit of a disaster. I think it was in Maine, wasn't it?
That's correct. Yeah, I was doing an internship.
So tell me how an experienced hiker does this then.
I think I did the internship when I was around, I think I was 21, and I had an internship working for the University of Maine at the Darling Marine Center. So mostly I was scuba diving in Maine, and
wow, I bet it's freezing, wasn't it?
It was cold. I had to wear a dry suit the whole summer.
Yes.
So, I was like all focused on my internship, but I think some of the other interns had some crazy idea about going hiking and backpacking somewhere in Maine for the weekend. So I just wanted to get away. And I had this vision of myself as being from Colorado, and that, this would be the sort of thing that just comes naturally to me. And I had my mom's borrowed external frame backpack from like the 1970s, and I had a really old down sleeping bag. And I thought that was all I needed to take off and go on this trip with the other two interns. And we got up there and it was just pouring rain, of course. And I think we were hiking on the AT, because I'm pretty sure we were trying to go for a shelter somewhere. And I just remember going up and up and up and up into the rain on this steep trail and being miserable, and all my stuff was wet within the first 20 minutes. So I actually convinced my two friends to turn around and go back and scrap the whole idea. And I think we ended up just getting a hotel room and going for like a day hike the next day when the rain cleared up. But I just was like that first. I think that was kind of my first backpacking attempt, I would say. And, when I went back to hike the AT, I started out in Maine, actually. I went southbound. So I felt like I redeemed myself quite a bit by being able to hike the whole entire AT.
But it's funny, when someone is well known as a hiker or has a history of hiking along a lot of trails and so on, you seem to think it comes easy to them. And I think you have to learn this stuff by experience. And I think we all tend to take away things about ourselves and maybe even our capabilities when we hike. And it's quite a humbling thing. What did you think you took away from that first attempt? Or did you think, I was just unprepared and I won't be so unprepared next time?
That's a really good question. And it just occurs to me that on that particular instance, I was just following somebody along. Like I had no agency in that experience. Like I just was tagging along, and I didn't even know where I was. How irresponsible is that to be hiking somewhere and I don't even remember, had no idea where we were going to, and I had no map. So I would say my first successful hiking trip or backpacking trip in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, I was by myself. So I was completely responsible for figuring out where I was going and learning everything I needed to learn about that experience. And I did borrow quite a bit of gear, but that was the first hike I went on where I just purchased my first backpack. It was 7 pounds alone. It was an old Danish.
Happy days.
The backpack alone was like my base weight now. And I had done the research into seeing where I could hike on the Big Island and, taking agency in that hike. And I would say that's been a big success in all of my through hiking, is that pretty much I've done all the planning and, by myself and, learned everything on my own. So I've done a lot of solo hiking. I've started out most of my hikes being solo, and I really enjoy learning from being alone, I guess.
Yeah, but you know what you do, don't you? You make mistakes, you don't do that thing again, don't you? It's quite a humbling thing when you make a mistake, you realise you shouldn't have done it, so you don't do it again. So you just mentioned taking agency. Of course, most people refer to it in the Appalachian Trail community, I guess, as hiking your own hike. And I guess they do on the PCT and the CDT as well. That's what you mean by that, isn't it? Choosing the way. And yours is a great example, actually, of somebody who just followed somebody along because you thought you'd go out for a hike and you didn't know enough about it. So you were really at the behest of somebody else, weren't you?
Definitely, yeah. And, contrary to that very first experience, I'd say, especially in the way I've hiked the 3 major trails for the Triple Crown, I've actually gone southbound for all of those trails. So I kind of went, outside the box in my thinking about which way. I really wanted to have a more solitary experience in that regard. And it's not that I don't like hiking with others, but I just like doing things a little differently. And So there's there's more thought that maybe goes into a southbound hike. I
want to come to southbound hikes in a minute, but before we get to that, because a hike that you completed, I think your first through hike was the Colorado Trail back in 2017, and one that you've been back to, according to your website, a few times since as well. Do you think that's a good one to start with? Because 500 miles isn't this massive 4 or 5 or 6 month experience. It probably took you about a month or something like that, a month and a half.
Yeah, I think it was about 1 month, right?
Yeah.
And I picked the Colorado Trail because I'm from, I grew up in Colorado. That's where I was born. And I wanted to take the opportunity to go see family. It was also, I'm very pragmatic and kind of detailed. I started with that hike because I was actually wanting to make sure I was prepared to go do the Terra Aurora. And that was my bigger focus at the time.
It's a big old shakedown, isn't it? It's a 500-mile hike on the trail.
Right. Well, and I've been building up to that through hike for the past 20 years. I've been backpacking. Sure. So I'd done a section hike on the AT. By that point, I'd gone from Fontana down to Hot Springs, and I'd done a lot of shorter hikes. I did the Trans Catalina Trail, so I guess you could technically say that was my first through hike because I did the whole trail there, which was a really fun hike. And in the Colorado Trail just seemed like a natural progression. I had a friend that was doing it, and a really good opportunity to go home and be around family and get to hike through my home state. So
go and be around family, but in fact, go out and hike, basically.
Yeah.
I see what that means, yeah.
I did take a 00 because my family's like right at the halfway point near Salina.
Oh, right, I see.
Worked out well.
By the way, was it a good preparation? I'm going to talk about Terra Aurora in a minute. Was it a good preparation for the Terra Aurora?
Oh, I would say, the Colorado Trail is definitely a good trail to start out on. There's plenty of resupply towns. It's a good, there's outdoor gear companies. If you have any gear, you need to change anything out, try different things. So if anybody's preparing to do the TA, it's good to make sure you got your gear dialed in, because when you go to a foreign country, especially one as remote as New Zealand, it's hard to find, last minute gear replacements, and even a Sawyer filter would be excessively expensive to buy there. So you really want to make sure you've got everything worked out before you get there, I think.
I toured around New Zealand with 30,000 Brits in 2005 following the British Lions rugby tour to New Zealand for 3 weeks, basically 30,000 drunken people, pubs every single day. And I had no idea of the Terra Aurora at the time. I kind of wish I'd known that, because I had some terrible hangovers in that one, but that's another story entirely. So when did the idea of becoming almost a full-time hiker plant itself in your brain? Was there something you said to yourself, this is something I can do pretty much all the time? And how do you make that work financially?
Well, besides the Colorado Trail and Terra, I really hadn't planned on doing that many other through hikes, but I came back from finishing the TA, and it was I was really struggling with what to do next. And I guess I'm kind of at a weird place in my life in that I've worked for quite a bit of time, almost 20 years. So I did have a decent savings to be able to continue on hiking for another few more years. And then I think because, when 2020 hit, and I also suffered from the loss of my dad passed away that year as well. So I've been trying to get over some, I guess, midlife things in this time.
Well, the show is called the Ultimate Midlife Crisis. So I'm with you. I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I really kind of just hit it right at that moment, turned 38 and started hiking, and now I'm still going with that because it seems to be working for right now, and I have enough savings. And
I'm sure.
Yeah.
So you did the Terra Aurora, and I was reading on your website again today. Tell us about the hut system, because I don't think I'd read about that before, because they're not really like the shelters that we're used to on the AT, are they? They're quite a bit better.
Yeah, the New Zealand hut system in general, there are some amazing huts that you can stay in. And this was kind of one of my first introductions to backpacking, was when I went to New Zealand in 2003. And I bought a car there, and my whole goal was just to like tour around the country. But mostly I ended up just driving to trailheads, parking the car and going for a walk, and found out really quickly I was finally starting to get into lightweight backpacking by leaving half of my stuff in the car because I didn't need a tent. And I bought a backcountry hut pass for almost nothing back then, and just would go stay in these amazing little huts. And it was fun just to like tour all of the huts along the way, because some of them are at the time were like old schoolhouses from the logging days from the 1920s.
Nice.
I actually met a guy who was a real life trapper employed by the New Zealand government to trap possums, and he was living in one of these huts. So that one actually had a generator, and it was just like really interesting and it's very similar to the AT in that you meet, a whole range of characters in these places, and there's somewhat of a community, and you can sit down and have your dinner with all these people and talk about different stories and
whatnot. Are you open to community on the trail?
Am I open to it?
Yeah, because you've done so many miles now. So do you find yourself, do you get enjoyment out of that, meeting other people, other hikers in other words?
Absolutely. Yeah. I love meeting people out on the trail and hearing people's different experiences. I mean, that's kind of what keeps me addicted, is finding out from other people all these different trails that they've hiked. So definitely helps feed your addiction. And just, although I wouldn't say I got into it as much on the AT as most hikers do, I would say I definitely experienced that on Tararua and staying at the huts along the way, which, by the way, are these like 4-sided shelters. You asked how they're different. Like I said, they are pretty elaborate. There was one where I showed up and they had an electric heater, or maybe it was a gas heater or something. The place was heated, and it was a brand new hut. And lucky for these 2 Irish guys that had just came with, like, they didn't even have a sleeping bag. And it snowed that night. So it was really good timing to have a heated hut. And, it actually, I remember there was one, I hiked all day in the rain, and I got to the hut and I was the only one there. And I worked for like an hour to try to start a fire in the little stove. And I finally was successful in doing that. And it just was like the most wonderful feeling, being in this little backcountry hut all by myself with the fire going. And they're just amazing, amazing treasure for the New Zealand people and visitors to that, because, the weather is pretty extreme sometimes there. So it's really nice to have a roof.
More and more people are going there, aren't they, to do Tararua? Was it quite busy when you were out there, or did you go at a pretty good time for it?
I would say I went at a very good time. Obviously the whole country was shut down for a period of about 2 or 3 years because of the pandemic. So
yeah, how could you get in?
How'd
you get in? You went in 2017-18, didn't you?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I just was able to do it, before all of this happened. And I was very grateful for that. And I think, I don't know how this year is. I'm sure it's going to pick up in popularity again as the country opens up full time to visitors. I'm sure they have quite a few hikers just this year. I know somebody over there right now. I think the year I hiked, there were maybe a couple hundred hikers.
It's still not that used. Not massively busy then, is it?
And it's unfortunately, it's going to suffer from some pretty bad growing pains in the years to come if it gets to become the levels that, the AT or PCT are seeing, because so much of the trail you have to pass through private land. A lot of that is farms. And I don't see the farmers being too open to having thousands of people come through their property as opposed to maybe a couple hundred. There's already issues with livestock interference and stuff like that. So
Yeah, funny enough, I've heard about that before, and it makes you realise how lucky we are to have the trails we do have over here, doesn't it, really? Because they are massively used, but they need to be massively looked after as well. But I want to talk about the thing you mentioned earlier on about going SOBO. Is that a deliberate decision because you want it to be slightly, you want to be slightly different and be more by yourself? Or do you like the different considerations you have to make to do a SOBO hike?
Well, so the first two trails I did, Colorado Trail and Tararua, those are both traditionally southbound trails anyway.
Yeah, yes.
Tararua makes a lot of sense because you're going towards the South Pole, the opposite, the other hemisphere. So you hike that trail basically it's in a similar orientation as the northbound hike.
Sure.
So everything's backwards down there. And it makes sense on that trail because there's one portion where you actually are rafting or kayaking or canoeing down a river. So kind of hard to paddle up the river.
Yes.
Yeah.
That would be an achievement.
Going the other way. So, it's got the aqua blazing part. And then, the timing of getting back from the Tararua around March, I didn't quite get my act together until about May or June for the next hike. And so it was already too late to start the PCT going north. And, with the permit system now, you have to plan for that well in advance. And I was able to get a southbound permit, and the timing worked out perfectly to do that hike. So I really didn't give much consideration to it initially. But after doing the southbound hike of the PCT, I really relished my experience with that. A lot fewer hikers.
That would be even more alone than the AT, wouldn't it? Because that is very traditionally south to north, isn't it?
Right. There were a fair amount of other southbound hikers. It was funny because most of Washington, there was a little bubble at first, and then I didn't hike with anybody for about 300 or 400 miles, and then all the northbounders that I started passing were telling me about all these southbounders that they were passing, and that there was a big bubble right in front of me. And I didn't know any of these people. They were just ahead, and they tell me how many there were, and I'd be like, sure, whatever. I finally caught up to a lot of those people, and there were plenty of hikers at any given time to be able to commune with, really.
So once you'd done the first 2 or 3 all southbound, was that then that's what I'm going to do now? and it kind of makes sense in many ways because that's what you like that part of it, don't you? You like the thing that is slightly not counterintuitive, but certainly against the grain a little bit.
Yeah. I like the notion. I love when people tell me I'm going the wrong way. That's always fun. And
For the 50th time that day, no doubt. Yeah.
Just doing my own thing or, feeling, I always have been a little bit like against the grain. So it suits me. I really like my interactions with trail angels. And that's something I've really appreciated especially as a southbound hiker, is like sometimes I think the trail angels feel a bit overwhelmed strictly by the numbers. So as I got down to those parts of the trail where it was like much more quiet, granted there aren't as many trail magic opportunities, but interactions I did have with a few trail angels, like, staying at Donna Sawflies, there's only like 5 or 6 of us there at the time. So I actually got to sit down and have a conversation with her. She wasn't running around like a chicken with her head cut off, trying to accommodate hundreds of hikers. I just really like to have more one-on-one conversation with the people I meet and to feel like I have a better quality experience with the trail angels along the way. And that stems from my experiences on the Tararua. That was like, they weren't really used to having through hikers. So I would meet trail angels that didn't even know what trail angeling was. They were just being like as they call it, the Kiwi hospitality is very strong.
You've referred to it in a couple of your posts on a couple of your on your website. You referred to it quite a few times, actually, trail angels. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So she likes interacting with those people because it's part of the trail thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it was definitely more of a New Zealand specialty too. It's like they talk about that their hospitality towards strangers, and I experienced that in all of my trips to New Zealand. And I would get invited in for having tea, and often to stay the night. And I just really relished that aspect of traveling through the country.
One more thing, the CDT you did you did a bit of a flip flop, did you? Was that because you were too late to do a southbound, or it wouldn't have worked? I don't even know whether about CDT. So
yeah, I actually started. I wanted to give northbounding a try at least, and I was actually just really anxious to get on the trail that year. So I started from the Mexico and New Mexico border. And yeah, I really enjoyed going northbound. I guess it was a sign for the trail that something about it wasn't right for me, because I actually had to leave the trail in Grants, New Mexico because of a family emergency.
Right.
So my intention was to hike to the Colorado border. And that was a high snow year, so I was planning to flip-flop regardless.
Right.
So I ended up not going as far as I had anticipated. So I did the vast majority of the trail southbound, and that was always my intent. And the CDT is, I think, a trail that definitely lends itself to a southbound hike more so than the other two.
Okay.
Mostly because of the way that the San Juans are positioned in Colorado and having lots of snow usually.
Sure. Funny, because people on this show know I think going southbound on the Appalachian Trail is a nightmare, because your approach trail is climbing Katahdin. I find I just can't get my head past that, frankly. But I don't want to talk about that for a second, because after a couple of years out on a trail, you got a bad diagnosis in November 2019. What actually happened to you?
Oh, so right. When I finished the CDT, I jumped over from Grants, New Mexico to the Utah and Arizona border to finish my southbound hiking the Arizona Trail. So It was a long hiking year. That ended up being, I think, 3,500 miles with adding the Arizona Trail. So, and I would definitely say I was pushing the mileage. I think I was hiking that with a friend that I met on the PCT, who you've actually interviewed, which is his name's Stellar. But we were like pushing pretty big miles on the AZT, and I'd been pushing big miles all throughout on the CDT, and with all the elevation going through Colorado, and a lot of dehydration as well, because we weren't finding many water sources on the AZT.
Right, really?
So by the end of that trail, I was having really bad migraines, and I thought they were migraines. They were actually headaches caused from having a blood clot in my brain.
Wow.
So
how did they resolve that? How'd they resolve that?
After landing in the hospital for about 5 days, which I've never even spent one night in a hospital before, I basically just was on a blood thinner for like another 8 months.
Right. Yeah, I got
that, and it eventually just goes away.
I got a blood clot to my lung. Pulmonary embolism. They said it was a 30% mortality rate. I said, that's not very good, is it? So that wasn't good. And I was on Xarelto. Were you on Xarelto for the blood thinner?
I was just taking warfarin.
Oh, right. Because they told me, if you start bleeding, go straight to the emergency room, because it ain't stopping.
Yeah. Luckily, I was able to get all the tests. They didn't find anything irregular with my blood that would be prone to coagulation again or something.
You never had any problem then coming back and then hiking at elevation again, or did you say to them, can I hike at elevation going forward?
Yeah, I kind of doubled up on the elevation thing. In 2020, I was still on the blood thinner. I was still going in for checkups, and I ended up in Colorado because of family issues, and to kind of relieve some stress and get outside, I started tackling as many 14ers as I could. Yeah. So I went on a hike, marathon hike, going up and back, because I'd hiked Pikes Peak. That was my first 14er years and years ago. And then I decided because I had done that one, I had hiked up and then I had taken a car back down. I figured it was a good time to go do that peak by doing it round trip, hiking up and back down. So that's a 26-mile hike for the day. And that one hurt.
And you had no problem. You had no problem with your head after that.
That first hike, I was definitely feeling it. Yeah. No, my head hurt. I got a really bad migraine on the way back down. I definitely had some altitude sickness.
And so your doctor's still saying that you're okay to go hiking, whether they do or not, because you're still hiking, aren't you?
I didn't even ask them. No, I didn't talk to my doctors about doing 14ers at that point. I just kind of found myself in that position. Like, I wasn't even supposed to be in Colorado at the time. I was dealing with my father being ill, and I was actually supposed to hike the AT in 2020, or
Sure.
that was my plan.
Sure.
And, with everything going on with the pandemic, obviously that wasn't happening, but I could at least get out and go do local hikes in Colorado, where I was, temporarily staying. And so I just started, doing some of those peak bagging. I was never really into peak bagging before that, but I started doing
While you're there, why
on
not? Yeah, while you're there, why not?
Yeah,
why not
I did a few 14ers on the CDT, and of course I did Mount Whitney when I hiked the PCT. So
I did that myself this year. I did that myself this year. How about that?
Yeah, Mount Whitney. Yeah, that was I think that was either my third, I don't remember which, that might have just been my second 14er, because I think by that point I'd only hiked Pikes Peak. I think I did one or two when I did the Colorado Trail, but at this point, I think I've done yeah, it's hard to keep on track. I just know in 2020 in the summer, I did 20 14ers. So that's how I keep straight on that.
You're exhausting, woman.
So there's still about half of them I have left to do in Colorado. Yeah.
So you're back on the trail, and in 2021, you did the Grand Enchantment Trail in the early part of the year, followed by a southbound Appalachian Trail hike. I seem to recall when we spoke about this the other day, you got so many things to talk about with you. It's difficult for me to pinpoint one. And I know the Appalachian Trail wasn't your favorite, was it? Did you enjoy it though?
Oh no, I definitely enjoyed it. I wouldn't say it. They're all kind of my favorite, but obviously you can't pick. If I had to pick just a few, it wouldn't be in the top three. But I actually really enjoyed the AT, and I did it my own way. I did it fairly fast. I, went southbound. I had a good time. The first couple weeks were rough. I have to admit, it's a very hard trail through New England. And I think it was a good challenge physically. I was very proud to get all the way through Maine when I hadn't even been able to survive one night on the trail before. And so that was an accomplishment for me. And I think I did really great on that trail, and I had a really awesome time. I did actually end up hiking quite a bit of the trail with a few other people. And I saw, it was nice meeting the variety of people at the shelters. I didn't even stay in a shelter for the first 3 or 4 weeks, but once things kind of quieted down, I was staying, being more, and, meeting all the section hikers. And, the AT actually has a lot of meaning to me, because that was the first long trail I knew about, because I went to school on the East Coast, and I've done quite a few. I had done a few section hikes up to that point. I'd done the long trail as well. So I really enjoyed the AT.
So of the hikes you've done, unless I see, but looking at your list, it's about 10 or 11 hikes. I'm not quite sure of different hikes. Which was the most challenging for you personally? And it may not have been the most difficult, but which was the most challenging for you personally?
I guess the CDT was pretty challenging in terms of that. That was when I found out that my father had been diagnosed with cancer. He had a melanoma, and that's a pretty tough one once it's progressed to stage 4. So that trail felt kind of disjointed because of the flip-flop, and it's just a tough trail. But then I've done some similarly difficult routes since then. Primarily with the Grand Enchantment Trail and the Mogollon Rim Trail, which are two kind of invented routes that were made up by Brett Tucker. And he's got an awesome sense for routing through these very inhospitable places. And it was, I enjoyed the adventure of those. Yeah. So I would say the Grand Enchantment, I didn't have the best, we actually I got norovirus on that trail, and that was a tough trail for me too. And then just this past summer, I did the Pacific Northwest Trail, and that was a tough trail in the sense that I ended up changing all my plans at the last minute because there was so much snow and glacier and the Whitefish Mountains. So I ended up flip-flopping on that trail, and that worked out really well. Cool. So it started off a little tough, but
you've got these challenges. You've taken on these challenges, and if you could only ever hike one trail again for the rest of your life, which one would that be? And it doesn't necessarily need to be most people say their first trail is the one they like the best. But is there something you think that's special about one trail in particular?
Yeah, they say, your first trail is always going to be the one you love the most. And Terra Aurora was kind of that for me. And then followed up so quickly by the PCT. The whole experience almost melds together into one experience because the two trails were so close to each other. And both of those, I just had the best experience. And I would say the PCT was probably like the most perfect trail for me. I barely struggled. I didn't have any real bad weather days. Everything just fell into place perfectly. So, a lot of people say the PCT would be the one they would. I would definitely like to rehike that. I haven't repeated any trails yet, and that's definitely probably first on the list. The one I would do again. But I think I also really love doing the PNT this summer.
All right.
So that one, I'm really in love with like the Pacific Northwest now. So, which is why I'm going to go hike in Utah on the Haydock Trail.
I was about to say, you're living in Miami. You couldn't get much further away from it, could you? Really?
Yeah, I'm looking at doing the Great Divide Trail this next summer. So that one would be more of that kind of environment. And I love those mountains up there. They're so amazing.
Now, last question. You're now in your early to mid 40s. Are you a person are you just living in this moment now and not thinking ahead? Or do you ever consider what you might be doing, say, in your mid 50s? Do you ever think ahead like that?
Gosh, I do struggle with that. And when I try to think ahead, I think I'm more living in the moment and not trying to face reality. I guess I am.
Right. Not trying to face reality. Excellent line.
Yeah, I'm definitely living in the moment and getting to that point where it's like, okay, well, there's still some more trails that I can do next, and keep putting off what it is I'm going to actually do with my life. But maybe I've also thought that maybe this is just it. And, I just came back from going to an event called Billy Goat Days Billy Goat Day.
You mentioned that, yeah.
We celebrate Billy Goat and his birthday, and they have this event in Florida. And I just, you go to those kind of events and you meet a lot of people that are in the same position as you. And you see people that have just been hiking for 20 plus years, like Billy Goat himself. And, you look at those people and you're like, maybe this is okay. I don't know.
Yeah, of course it's okay. It's like, your life is it wouldn't be a life for everybody, but certainly it fits you, doesn't it? So I can tell from your blog. I mean, you love this. You just revel in this, and it comes across in your blog, which I think is a great thing. But look, I really as I said to you before, I was struggling a little bit to work out what your story was because there's so much of it. But I still feel there's so much more of it still to be written as well. So I'm interested in following along with your blog now to see what happens next, because you've got such a wide array of things you still can do, can't you, around the world? Remember that there's that one from South Africa all the way up to Vladivostok, I think, in the north of Russia, about 15,000 miles. So you might want to try that one.
Yeah, I've gotten to the point where people keep bringing up these different hikes, and I'm like, oh gosh, not another one. Like, I don't want to know about that.
Well, I appreciate you coming on to share your story with us. And I'm going to follow along and see what else you do. And if you do any other exciting things, I might give you a call and get you back on the show.
Great. That would be fun.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for calling, or thank you for this interview.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
As I said before, there's so much to Leah's background in hiking that it was kind of tough to cover it all in any depth, but I think we captured her approach and her enjoyment of the sport, so it worked out. Her blog is excellent, by the way, so you should certainly check that out. The link will be in the show notes, as will be a couple of spectacular pictures that she sent me. Check those out too. While I remember, I wanted to let you know that I'll be speaking at the AT Kickoff on Sunday, March the 5th at 10:30 a.m. It's at the Lodge in Amicalola, so I hope some of you can make it. Now let's hear from Mary Marks, who's our last member to join the class of 23, yet one of the furthest along on her through hike attempt this year. Here's Mary. Well, today we're going to meet the last member of the Mighty Blue class of 2023, and Mary Marks and I have tried to connect a few times before, and I've failed badly on this. So, hey, Mary, how are you?
I'm well, Steve. Thank you.
And you are actually out on the trail right now, I know. We'll talk about where you are and what's going on right now later in a minute. So, why are you out there? Why are you doing this trip?
Oh, Steve, that question changes every day.
I'm sure.
But basically, just when I started day hiking back in the 2000s, early 2000s, I would run across these through hikers and discovered that they're going all the way to Maine. And, it just kind of blew me away that was an actual thing. And when I did day hike, it just wasn't enough.
Yes.
I just wasn't, I just wanted to go longer, go more. And then when I started hiking solo, I was able to do that. And then one day I was working in Waynesboro, Virginia, and did a day hike. And on the overpass, right outside the trail, there's a young man sitting there. And I could tell he was a thru hiker because I've spoken to many of them on the trails. And out of character for me, I stopped and wound down the window and I said, "Hey, do you need a ride?" He goes, "Yeah, I do." He was kind of hesitant. I said, "Come on." My backpack was in the back, so no, I wasn't, just randomly picking up some young man. And he got in, and I ended up taking him all the way to Charlottesville, which isn't far from Waynesboro, but, a good drive.
Yeah.
And I just grilled him for every bit of information. And when he got out of the car, he was taking a zero to meet some friends. And I asked him, "Hey, let me give you my number. When you get to Katahdin, please send me your picture."
Oh, that's so
lo
cool.
and behold, he sent me a couple months later, because he was on day 52 when I met him.
Mm-hmm.
He sent me his picture, as promised. "Here's my picture. Thanks for the ride." And that picture has been on my fridge since 2016.
That is
awesome. He was such an
awesome.
inspiration to me.
Well, that is awesome. And you and I met at the end of last year when we did the Woods Hole weekend. And I also met your good friend, Wiley. And so tell us, so you're not actually hiking solo, are you?
I'm not. I have my dog Wiley with me. He's a standard poodle. And he has quite a few hiking miles under his little paws.
Yeah.
Last year we did over 500 miles together. The year before, close to that. So he has a bit of experience, and he's doing great.
So tell us then how, you're on the trail. When did you actually start then, Mary?
I tell people now that I'm on day 13 only because I started January 3rd.
Yeah.
I went out for a birthday hike.
Yeah.
And I went to Amicalola to get my tag. And of course, I didn't have them then. And I went to Neil Gap and had decided on those 3 days that, you know what, I'm not going to do this section again because I had done it 3 times already. Yeah. So I took about 5 weeks off to finish up some work commitments and started back February 12th.
Right.
So I've been out a solid week now.
So how does it feel, because this is probably one of the longest times you spent on the trail, isn't it? So how is it working out for you?
Oh my gosh, it's wonderful, Steve. I mean, it's, I expected the absolute worst, the worst weather, the worst pain,
Yeah.
And it's been great. But with that said, I'm taking my time. I've taken several Neros because the weather, and like that first day in Neil Gap, just getting there, the goodbyes, and then it snowed. So I didn't get a lot of miles in that day, but I plan to do at least 10 miles a day. I'm giving myself 221 days. So that's an average of 10 miles a day. And I'm only in the deficit maybe 10 miles. So that's not going to be a problem.
So do you find you're strengthening already, or is this because you and I are not in the first flush of youth? You're younger than me, but it's, we're not in the first flush of youth, and it is tough on our older bodies, I guess. Are you finding your body is adapting well to it?
It is. I'm so surprised because I thought, oh gosh, I've been out for 7 days before and really kind of not suffered terribly, but really felt it days after. So I think the key is not to stop. I'm afraid to take a zero. I'm truly afraid to take a zero. Neros are good for me. You get your stuff done, you get refreshed. But yeah, I feel great.
Tell people how you're planning a Nero.
Well, I break camp, decide which trail I'm going to get off, and what hostel is nearby, and maybe hike 5 miles. Well, yesterday when I got off, I hiked 11 miles.
Oh, right.
To Winding Stairs Gap. Now, by the time you get off, it's late in the afternoon, and then you still have time to get to your destination and do your laundry and get some food and resupply and get a good night's sleep.
Yeah.
And now I'm packed up, ready to go sock packing today.
And you are now in Franklin?
I am.
Right. And hopefully you're not speaking in the middle of the room in the hostel.
I am not. I have a private room.
All right. And do you intend to do that most of the way? Be more comfortable by yourself, or are you happy to sort of share rooms with a bunch of people?
Well, only because of Wiley, I'm required to get a private room.
Of course, that's right.
They don't typically let dogs in the bunk room.
Of course, yeah.
But I think even if he wasn't with me, I would probably get a private room.
And I hadn't really thought about that because I know it's been a problem in the past. Are some places refusing dogs, or do you know in advance they're refusing dogs?
I kind of did my research there, just not to run into those problems.
Right. Well, I'm glad you're well. I'm glad you're out there. Have you acquired a trail name yet?
Well, I got one last year when I section hiked the Smokies. I ran into a ridge runner and Amelia, and we hiked together for about 5 days. I hiked, from shelter to shelter, I should say. And she suggested Poppins.
Poppins. Oh, what that is
and
lovely.
I thought, like Mary Poppins, I have an umbrella. My first name is Mary. It kind of fit. I thought it was kind of corny, but then doggone it, she's the first hiker that I ran into and said, "Hey, what's your trail name?" Out comes Poppins.
And do you find Poppins is any different to Mary? Or I'm writing a speech at the moment, and one of the things I'm trying to say to people is that getting a trail name can make you anybody you want to be and present the best version of yourself. Is Poppins Mary, or do you feel changes in yourself at all?
I don't feel any changes in myself. But Poppins it's been kind of fun, actually, now that it's kind of grown on me. And I've several people, that I met 7 days ago, all of a sudden I'll hear someone say, "Hey, Poppins."
Yes.
And I was like, okay, that's me. Yeah.
Being addressed by your trail name is kind of not jarring, but it's kind of strange when it first happens, but then it becomes part of who you are. So I think it's great.
Right, yeah.
So you're out there now. You've already started, obviously. What are you most looking forward to on this hike?
Oh, I am looking forward to hiking above tree line.
Right. Yeah, you're going to love it. You're going to wait for a while. You're going to wait for a while for that, but yeah.
I know, but it's I got that first 100 miles under my belt, so
And is there any?
I'm on my way.
And is there any fear at all? I mean, what are you least looking forward to?
Well, least looking forward to probably, the chiggers and ticks and poison ivy.
Yeah.
Those are a given for me. But
Right.
I'm most not looking forward to if I have to send my dog home.
Of course, yes. And what are you going to do with him in the smokies?
My daughter will come pick him up, take him
perfect.
home for a week because
Perfect.
we're not far, just a couple hours from there. And, he'll get refreshed, get a haircut, and she'll bring him back the next week.
Ready to go again. Cool. Well, look, I'm so glad that we met, Mary, and you agreed to be on the show. I just wish, as I wish everybody, I wish you very well, and just stay in touch with me. Text me when you got an update, and we'll jump on the phone the way we have done this. Perhaps not at 6:30 in the morning.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it's been a pleasure, Steve. Thank you so much.
Good to talk to you. Take it easy, okay?
Bye-bye.
Bye. Mary was so gracious when we did a pack shakedown at the Woodshole weekend. She took on several suggestions and was entirely open to the review. And her dog, Wiley, he is such a calm dog and so in tune with Mary that I'm sure they're going to have a great adventure together. Now Dr. Lynn with Lyme disease as this week's topic. This is something to be taken seriously, so I know that many of you already understand quite a bit about it. But I learned a couple of things on this one, so take notice. And as in other weeks, Lynn has provided me with notes on the subject, and I put those notes every week into a Google Drive file that you can access. Again, you'll find the link in the show notes. Here's Lynn. Well, we're back on with Dr. Lynn. Hey, Lynn, how are you?
I'm doing all right today.
Good, good. And in fact, when I called Lynn, she was actually on the phone talking about a patient. So she's working even while she's recording for us, which is certainly showing the right attitude, let me tell you. And today you sent me notes on Lyme disease, which of course I think is, the ticks on the AT particularly are the most dangerous animal on there. So give us a brief overview of what Lyme disease is.
Lyme disease is an illness that is transmitted by ticks. It's the Borrelia burgdorferi spirochete that actually causes the disease, and the
Easy
ticks
for you to
just
say. Try that again.
How many years have I been practicing that, right?
Yes. Yeah,
especially being a physician in Connecticut, where Lyme disease was invented, if you can call it that.
Yeah.
And it's transmitted by ticks, and it can cause a number of very mild to actually life-threatening symptoms that we get. Things just as little as a rash or a headache or a feeling of flu, all the way to severe arthritis, heart inflammation, brain inflammation.
Wow.
And people can be very sick and wind up in the hospital for several weeks.
Are some people more predisposed to it than others, or is it simply the case of whatever that gets injected into you by the tick depends upon what that is more than anything else?
Yeah, that's correct. There's really no documented evidence that certain people are more prone to Lyme disease than others, or more prone to tick bites than others. Just like some people feel like they're more prone to mosquito bites than others. And that could be true, but we don't have any documented evidence as to who would be more prone to Lyme disease or who wouldn't.
So I remember before I went on the trail in 2014, I'm sure permethrin had been invented, but I obviously never read about it. I never read the book. So I know that before I went in 2019, there was permethrin to spray everything. So talk us through why that works and if it does work really well.
Permethrin is one of the 3 chemicals that can be used to help deter the tick from attaching to the body. Permethrin is used to coat clothing to reduce the rate of tick attachment. It's not used as an insect spray for the body itself. We have 2 other types of chemicals that can be used. Most people have heard of DEET, DEET. I cannot remember what the 4 letters actually stand for if you want to look them up. be my guest.
Okay.
But it is a compound that is used in insect sprays, and 30% DEET insect spray will help protect you for about 6 hours. However, people are concerned about the toxicity about DEET. There is evidence that it can potentially cause seizures or toxic to the nerves.
Good Lord.
But the absolute risk is very low. But some people, it just really concerns them, so they don't like to use it. The other thing is that DEET can be corrosive to synthetic fabrics such as Gore-Tex. So it's sometimes people like to spray insect spray around the bottom of their pants legs or around their waist to prevent ticks from getting in that way. But that can corrode and the fabrics. There's another chemical called picaridin.
Yeah.
It's been on the market in the U.S. since about the mid-2000s. And a 20% picaridin solution will give you about 10 hours of protection. And so far, there don't seem to be any toxic side effects to the picaridin. It does have a better safety profile than DEET. It's only been out for, maybe 10, 15 years, so we still need to see long-term effects.
Sure.
But it does appear to be better as far as the safety profile. It is odorless, and it is not harmful to the synthetic fabrics.
Oh, interesting.
This was something that was actually, I had heard about picaridin, but I didn't know the little details until I was actually doing the research for today's podcast. So I think that's because I've been using DEET myself, and I had never had an issue with it. And I've also not gotten so far any tick bites, but I think I'm going to switch to picaridin products myself at this point.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I seem to remember I had 98% DEET. Is that possible? It was a massive amount of DEET anyway.
Yes, it is possible. I don't know if they make that anymore. It's not necessary. The maximum amount that is needed to help protect against ticks is 30% DEET. You don't have to go higher than that. If you go lower than that, if you go lower than that, you will still be protected, but you might have to apply it a little more often.
Right. Well, funny enough, I'm going to tell you an old wife's tale now, and because it was told to me by an old wife, not one of my old wives, but a lady I met at a campsite. That's interesting. I shouldn't have said that. A lady I met at a campsite, and she's because I'd found 5 ticks on me the day before, or that day, in fact, and I happened to be camping next to her RV or something like that, and she said to me, just tuck your pant leg into your socks, spray from your knees down and all around the top, but where your socks are. She said you'll never see another tick. Now, that may have been lucky because I never saw another tick, but I did that spray every single day and I never saw another one. Have you heard that? Or is it just a case of trying to keep them out of entry into your clothes? Because long pant leg, they can climb up your legs, can't they? I presume.
Well, that lovely lady was absolutely accurate and correct. And that is one of the ways to help deter getting the ticks from climbing up your pant, underneath your pant leg, is to stick them into the socks. It's harder for a tick to get onto your leg if they have to work around underneath your sock.
I mean, it's not a good look, but who cares, really?
Who cares? Because, if it deters you from getting sick and you can continue and complete your trail, then that's the most important thing.
And from what you've written to me, and we're going to put this obviously in the show notes so people can actually look at this, and I'm grateful that a lot of people have downloaded quite often these notes. It looks like this is not getting any better, doesn't it? This is not improving the situation. It's getting worse in terms of its spread. And you said that 10 of the states where there are ticks, or on 10 of the 14 states where there are ticks, are now on the AT. That wasn't always the case, was it?
It used to be that Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses were really strictly in the area of Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York. It has spread. The most significant reason for spread has been climate change, because the increased warmth has allowed ticks to migrate. And in 2015, there were a lot of reports of Lyme disease. They said 14 states that were in the Northeast accounted for about 95% of Lyme disease.
Wow.
And 10 of those 14 states that were reported were on the AT. The ones that were not reported were Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Although West Virginia only has 4 miles, so I don't even know if you can count that. But that was in 2015. And so, several years later, I wouldn't be surprised if all 14 states that are on the AT have incidences of Lyme disease.
And how do you, as a hiker yourself, how do you do tick checks? Do you, particularly on your back, how does somebody, do you hike by yourself normally or with people?
I do. I hike by myself.
Right. So how do you check your back?
Sometimes you just can't.
Right.
I did not carry a mirror. Sometimes people say carry a mirror so you can look at all the little nooks and crannies. Some people do that. Now with cell phones, sometimes you can take a picture of yourself or turn your cell phone around and you can
I tried doing that in the past. That didn't work for me at all.
Honestly, you have to do the best that you can. The back is a tough area that you can't check that yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, but and you saying you notice that many people who've got it can't recall a tick bite, and I don't know whether I've been bitten by one or not. But if you're bitten by one, well, first, how do you know there's been a tick bite? What the signs that you know there's been a tick bite?
If you don't see a tick, but you see an insect bite, you have no idea if it's a tick bite or a mosquito bite or any other type of spider bite, something like that. Tough to say. You would have to actually see the tick. And not every tick that bites you is a tick that transmits Lyme disease.
Yeah.
The deer tick is the main tick that transmits Lyme disease, but then you have the dog ticks and the wood ticks and all that sort of stuff. And they don't necessarily transmit Lyme disease. Then you have ticks that transmit other tick-borne illnesses, which, they write whole books on tick-borne illnesses. So we won't go into that.
The bullseye, the classic bullseye, is what we've always heard of, but it says here it's only seen in about 70 to 80% of cases. Is that your best indication you've got one? You've had one?
Yes. And as a matter of fact, in the medical literature, if you have a classic bullseye lesion, you don't even need to do any type of serologic testing. You automatically get the doxycycline treatment because it's so classic for Lyme disease that's the test of choice. If it shows up, you actually are lucky because you know exactly what you got.
Now, I'm not sure if this is ethical or not, but if somebody came to you as a doctor and said, I'm hiking the AT, could you give me some doxycycline just in case? Is that something that you recommend or suggest or you just can't do? Yeah,
that's a tough one. I would personally not do that for my patients because the likelihood of actually contracting Lyme disease with a tick bite is actually very small. It's only about 2 to 3%. And the use of doxycycline or any antibiotic that's in a situation where it's not necessarily warranted could create a lot of other issues, including antibiotic resistance, side effects of doxycycline. One of the biggest side effects of taking doxycycline, especially in the summertime, is that you can get a very bad red rash if you expose your skin to the sunlight. Wow. So hikers are hiking. They've got, they're in the sunlight in the summertime. If you're taking doxycycline, you must cover up and you must use sunscreen. So the risks of taking doxycycline outweigh the benefits unless it's absolutely indicated.
Well, funny enough, I've got to tell you, Lynn, and you probably seen this yourself or heard it yourself, heck of a lot of people do take doxycycline. So some doctors are giving it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I absolutely know that. And that's fine. We all have our own little ways of managing things. I would personally much prefer to see somebody and diagnose them individually
So say you're rummaging around in your different regions of your body and you see a tick that's embedded there. What's the period of time you've got? Is it 24 hours or something like that before it starts injecting the stuff? I mean, how does that all work? And I know everyone's got the tweezers, and it isn't for pulling your hairs out, it's for pulling these things out, isn't it? So talk us through that. Once you see one, what do you do?
When you see one, you need to remove it as quickly as possible. Take the tweezers, if you can, put a little alcohol on them or sterilize them with your lighter or a match or something like that, because you don't want to introduce any bacteria into the bite. You want to grab the tick where it is right next to the skin, where it's bitten into the skin, hold on to it and gently pull up perpendicular to the skin in a steady pull so that you don't yank it out quickly. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get the tick to release on its own, because if it releases on its own, then you will have pulled out the tick in its entirety, and then you destroy the tick. If for some reason you pull and part of the tick is still in the body, do not try to dig it out, because you may introduce more bacteria or more problems into an insect site.
Now, you've already mentioned DEET, and is it picaridin, whatever it's called?
Picaridin.
That's the one, picaridin. Yeah. And we've also mentioned pyrethrin. I hike with long sleeves normally, and I see one of your things to protect yourself against a tick bite is long sleeve clothing and light coloured clothing. I didn't know about light coloured clothing. Why is that, do you think?
So light colored clothing simply makes it easier for you to see a tick that's on you.
Okay,
it doesn't necessarily protect against a tick bite more than dark colored clothing. It's just easier to see. Okay.
So we did mention this a few weeks ago. It was a listener's question about a Lyme disease injection. You say that is still several years away at the moment, as far as you know.
Don't know how long it is, but they are in phase 3 trials in Europe.
All right.
And hopefully we'll get something that will work really well.
Okay, cool. Well, that'd be a wonderful thing, because I know it's one of the biggest fears of most people on the trail. It isn't bears, it's not moose, or not snakes. It is getting bitten by a tick and getting Lyme disease. So I've got a pal of mine who has had Lyme now who was 15 years when I met him, so it's 20 years now, and he still feels it. So, it's a thing worth avoiding. But thanks very much for coming on again. What have you thought about what we might talk about next week?
Got a couple of things. We could do something about lightning strikes. We could do blisters.
Blisters. Do blisters, because people are starting the trial. Yeah, let's do blisters next week. Yeah.
Okay, so blisters it is.
Okay, well, good to see you, and I'll speak to you soon, all right?
Sounds good.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
So remember, if you have questions, feel free to reach out. There are no dumb questions when it comes to your health and safety. Just email me at steve@hikingradionetwork.com and I'll make sure that Lynn gets them. Thanks as ever today goes to our donors. This week, our monthly donors who stepped up again are Betty McEnany, Sean Wiley, Ann Pickin, Sharon James, Emmanuel Bravo-Ramos, Kevin Weidman and Alan Troy. Also, I got a lovely surprise in my P.O. box this week when I got a very generous postal money order from somebody who comes from Garrisonville, Virginia. I'm afraid I can't tell you their name. I couldn't read it. But I'm sure you know who you are, and I wanted you to know that I'm very appreciative for your generosity and of the generosity of all our donors. In fact, just this past Monday, I was at the Appalachian Trail Club of Florida meeting when a lady, who I've seen before at the club, but whose name I didn't know, came up to me and shoved some cash into my hand and said it was for the podcast. That was lovely, and I'm sure you know who you are, so thanks to all. Finally today, George Stefanos is learning the immense benefits of being able to eat as much as you like when you come to a restaurant on the trail. Marvellous. I'll see you next week. Saturday the 23rd of July, 1983, mile 1199.2. Last night, I took the set of clothes in which I've been hiking since Duncannon, brought them into the shower and scrubbed them with soap. When I checked out the hotel this morning, I put them back on. They were still a little damp, but a couple of miles of hiking took care of that. I carry one change in my backpack, but I don't like to wear them for hiking until the very last day before I hit the next supply town if I can manage it. That way, I always have a set of clean, dry clothes for when I encounter civilization. The clothes I wore for a few hours in Port Clinton after my shower are in my backpack, ready if I decide to spend the night in another town before I reach Delaware Water Gap. I love to have several changes of clothing, but the extra pounds definitely make a difference when you're hiking 20-mile days. Backpacking is an excellent method of learning the difference between what you would like to have and what you need to have. What I did need was a very early start this morning, because I intended to hike 23 miles today over the most vicious rocks and the most strenuous climbs yet in Pennsylvania. I left the hotel at 8:30. Oh well, my letters from home had still not arrived at the post office. I mailed some of my own and left a change of address card forwarding my mail to Delaware Water Gap. As usually happens when I leave a town, my hiking level was abysmal this morning. I required 90 minutes to hike the first 2 miles. It was of no help to my cause that the blazing was so careless that at one point I thought I'd lost the trail. In Pennsylvania, the Appalachian Trail passes through many segments of state game lands. Their borders are marked with splotches of white paint. As I've previously mentioned, the AT route is marked with rectangular blazes of white paint. At one point, on that initial climb out of Port Clinton, the AT blazes had been painted rather sloppily and sketchily, just as the trail was crossing a line of state game lands boundary blazes. The trail became overgrown and obscure, and after a half mile I decided I must have accidentally lost the AT and started following the game land's boundary. I backtracked a half mile before realising I had not left the AT. It was just overgrown and poorly marked. That little mix-up cost me about a half hour. The remainder of today's trail was relatively well cleared, but the rocks were brutal. Sometimes I walked across fields of boulders. Often I slipped and slid over piles of smaller, loose rocks. Other times I trod over the famous sharp-edged shark fin rocks. The one constant factor was that I was walking on one type of rock or another all day long. They slowed my pace and crucified my feet. As an added bonus, the trail route was rather weird today. It began with a healthy climb out of the Shilko Valley. Then the AT dropped back down off the ridge crest to pass by a spring located a good distance down the side of the mountain. The trail climbed all the way back up to the crest and immediately descended almost to the base of the mountain to a shelter beside a reservoir. It then returned to the ridgeline, followed the crest for a few miles and dropped all the way off the mountain in order to bypass a private sanctuary for hawks, eagles and other birds of prey. The trail climbed back up the ridge crest one final time and remained there for the remainder of the day. There were several good prospects from the trail today, and one great one along the few miles of ridge walk between the reservoir and the bird sanctuary. The pinnacle was the point of a long, narrow, wedge-shaped spur of Blue Mountain, perched atop a sheer escarpment of cliffs running along either side. They were better than the 300-degree views of the surrounding valleys. I looked out over a beautiful patchwork of greens and browns. Farm fields tinted dozens of shades of green followed the undulating contours of the valley floor, occasionally broken up by the golden brown of fallow fields and the deeper greens of patches of woodland. It was 2 o'clock and I had managed just 9 miles of hiking. I'd given up all hope of making it to the Allentown shelter today and was planning to pitch a tent. I sat down to take pictures and enjoy the finest viewpoint on the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania. Several other hikers were there when I arrived, including the spaceman, the through hiker who had witnessed with me the carnage at Birch Run shelters. He was just leaving as I showed up. Later, while preparing to depart myself, I got into a conversation with a pair of day hikers who told me that the latest forecasts were now predicting rain for tonight. That figured. It was 2:30 and at most 6.5 more hours of daylight and twilight remained to hike almost 14 miles if I was now to resume my endeavour of attaining the shelter. Knowing how I feel about tenting in the rain, you can be sure I had to make the attempt. Giving up on the long day had been a sensible decision. The constant rocks and frequent long climbs made it impossible to build any steady momentum today. In my enthusiasm for reaching Connecticut, I had been overdoing it for some time. Other than the usual half days into and out of trail towns, I had not given myself a short hiking day since Harper's Ferry. My last day off was in Waynesboro, Virginia. This grueling stretch has coincided directly with a heat wave of historic proportions. I've been spending way too many hours hiking and not enough recharging my batteries. My wasted dash to make the post office yesterday had drained what reserves I had left. Nevertheless, probably as a holdover from the early struggles of this journey, I absolutely hate backing down from a single goal. I wasn't feeling good about scrapping the long day I had planned. I felt a slight twinge of warped excitement at the thought of another race against darkness and fatigue. Soon after the pinnacle, the Appalachian Trail made the long descent off Blue Mountain in order to bypass Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, the oldest wildlife sanctuary for birds of prey in the world. On the floor of the valley below, the AT followed dirt roads very briefly through something called Eckville, which consisted of a few scattered houses and little else. From there it was a long climb, very steep towards the end, back up the mountain. By the time I had regained the ridge crest, I was no longer concerned about the probability of my packing out a wet tent tomorrow. I hardly took a step all day which didn't come down on at least one rock. The soles of my feet were beginning to feel as if an expert had worked them over with a blackjack. If they knew any secret plans, they would have spilled them hours earlier. Large purple bruises were forming beneath at least 6 of my toenails from being smashed repeatedly. I was so weary at that point, I was barely lifting my feet as I walked. Staying in a shelter tonight and avoiding the rain was just not worth all the crap through which I was going in order to get there. Contrary to the weather report I had heard 2 days earlier, the heat and humidity were on the rise again this afternoon, though not quite near the levels at which they had been earlier in the week. I pushed on stubbornly. Once I had accepted reaching the shelter as another challenge to myself, I created a goal of which I could not let go. That would have been too much like the old me. I was no longer greatly concerned about the rain, but I just could not quit. I passed the spaceman about 1.5 miles from the shelter. He'd pitched his tent in the forest beside the trail. I told him about the predicted rain and the nearness of the shelter and kept going, driving myself to the edge of my endurance. I roared into Allentown shelter at 8:50, just as darkness fell over the forest. A long rocky path led down the side of the mountain to water. I needed my flashlight for this trip. When I returned to the shelter, the spaceman had arrived. I slumped down on the floor, exhausted, and said, "Now watch. After all that, it probably won't rain." The words were barely out of my mouth when the sky opened and rain began hammering the tin roof. I finally had dinner at 10 o'clock. Sunday, the 24th of July 1983, mile 1217.8. I woke up late this morning, tired and sore, and moved slowly through preparations for departure. I did not get out on the AT until 8:30. The initial 4 miles of trail followed pleasant, relatively rock-free woods roads along the crest of Blue Mountain to Blue Mountain summit, the floor of a shallow gap through which Pennsylvania Highway 309 crosses the ridgeline. A Bavarian restaurant known as the Gramibus Inn was located at the road crossing. I arrived at 10 o'clock, just in time for a little mid-morning snack. The spaceman was already there, catching up on his journal writing after having finished his own breakfast. I was torn between 2 of the breakfast specials, so when it came time to order, I compromised. I had a great breakfast: steak and eggs, home fries, toast and orange juice. Then I had another great breakfast: pancakes, sausages, more home fries and more orange juice. It was a little bizarre while backpacking the Appalachian Mountains to be sitting in a Bavarian restaurant with German folk songs and polkas playing in the background, but I got over it. The place was a class act, spotless, expensively decorated and popular. The food was excellent, and the staff and the management of the inn were surprisingly cordial to backpackers. They were another example of those rare businesses along the AT which make a special effort to welcome through hikers, to the point of keeping a trail register, always an excellent indication of our regard. Had it not been so early, I would have broken the temperance pledge made to myself while sweating out 6 Bud Tall Boys on Peters Mountain in Virginia and sipped a couple of beers, but the inn did not begin serving alcohol until 1 o'clock. They had an interesting and expensive selection of imported German beers on the menu, most of which I had never even heard. One offering, called Berliner Weisse, was described as a tart yeast beer served with raspberry syrup. That sounded intriguing. The ensuing 2 miles of the Appalachian Trail, like the first 4 miles this morning, followed relatively rock-free woods. This was a great break for my feet, which had absorbed a savage battering yesterday. The final 12 miles were virtually all on rocks, completing the destruction. I've smashed virtually every toe at least several times in the past few days. They're very tender now. The pain of each new collision is becoming so intense it's almost nauseating. I now have large, dark bruises beneath 9 of my toenails. Inevitably, some of them are beginning to fall off and the rest are loose. I would be very surprised not to lose all 9 over the next week or so. I can feel them tear a bit more with each step. There were some great viewpoints along the trail, but the cost was high. I encountered some memorably nasty rocks. The descent from Bakeoven Knob into the adjacent gap where Bakeoven Knob shelter was located crossed an old slide covered with loose stones whose sliding days were obviously not yet over. They kept rolling and slipping beneath my feet. This section of trail was poorly marked and I kept losing the trail. The spaceman had left the restaurant this morning while I was waiting for my first breakfast to be served. I called up with him at Bakeoven Knob shelter at 3 o'clock. He was with another through hiker, codename the Sloth. We all spent an hour together at the shelter, reading the register and shooting the breeze. It was a decent shelter compared to the average Pennsylvania and Maryland hovel, but an unbelievably huge pile of assorted trash was crammed into a triangular space between the rear of the structure and a steep rise behind it. I've never seen anything like it in all my years of hiking. It towered above the roof of the place. A southbound backpacker from Quebec named Richard, pronounced Richard, stopped by to swap stories and valuable information about the trail ahead. The three northbounders, the spaceman, the Sloth, and just plain old me, all left together at 4 o'clock. The George W. Alderbridge shelter was still almost 8 miles ahead, but we made great time over the next 5 miles. We could easily have made it to the shelter by 7 o'clock, but it just was not meant to be. When we were still about 2.5 miles from home, we encountered the most insidious obstacle which Blue Mountain had yet thrown at us. A 1.5 mile long stretch descending through a scrubby area in which the path was bordered with a dense tangle of low bushes which slowed our pace to a crawl. It was not that the trail was overgrown. As a matter of fact, it was well cleared. No, it was a more subtle factor that brought us to our knees. Those shrubs were bursting with ripe wild blueberries. I have no idea how many berries I ate as I crept along that stretch of trail. Maybe the squirrels and chipmunks who were lining up to flip me the bird as I finally departed could tell you. My purple lips and I arrived at the shelter at 7:50. There was a gushing, piped spring not far away, a far cry from the usual gruelling trek to water in this state. The spaceman and I made our dinners while the Sloth, this is beginning to read like a bad spy novel, hiked on another mile to the next road crossing to meet some friends. Today was not a bad day, everything considered. Tonight I have a captivating view of the lights of the Lehigh Valley down below, an enormous full moon overhead, and a stomach smiling with contentment from 2 huge breakfasts and a gallon or so of fresh blueberries. Just 35 rocky, buggy, thorny, sweaty miles of Pennsylvania remain. My guidebook informs me that all the streams and springs along those final 35 miles dry up in early June. Gee, this could be a small problem.